Hello and welcome. My name is Raj Persaud. I'm a consultant doctor and psychiatrist. I'm based in Harley Street, London, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Professor David Pendleton. David is a professor of leadership at the Henley Business School, perhaps the most famous or one of the most famous business schools here in the UK. And I gave a talk at the business school about a year ago on how AI may or may not be replacing all our jobs. So, David, welcome to the program. Tell us a bit about your background. Tell us a bit about your connection with leadership and how you got to be an expert in leadership.
Well, thank you. And thank you very much for your welcome and for inviting me onto the program. I'm a psychologist by background. Did my doctorate a number of years ago, as most do in my profession, and started my first part of my career looking at some aspect of communication in healthcare. But what I graduated to over time was an understanding that an awful lot of the issues in the health service that were not communication issues tended to be organizational issues, and that got me interested in leadership. So I've been in the field of leadership for about 20 years now. And the ideas that I have developed have come really from three streams of activity. One is I have run my own company, a small company, but also been an HR director in a FTSE 100 company. So I've been a leader in my own right. The second thing is, as a consultant, I've worked, I think, in all but South America around the world. I've worked on every continent in just about every type of business you care or organization you care to name, public and private sector. And the third is, of course, as an academic, I've had an opportunity to sort of read the literature and review that and do some research in my own right. And so the ideas about leadership that I've come to talk about, work with, and consult in have come from the confluence of those three streams, really, Raj.
So leadership is in the news for various reasons at the moment. I mean, it's never really out of the news. It's such an important subject. I want to start with a slightly weird place to start, which is where FIFA World Cup is going on right now as we're talking. People may be listening to this many months into the future and forgotten about the FIFA World Cup. But at the Olympics, at the Rugby World Cup, we see this phenomenon whereby a team wins, and then the manager or the captain, famously the manager, will write a book about leadership, and he'll become a business guru. And companies will pay him tens of thousands of pounds to come along and give seminars or be an after-dinner speaker, where he's now an expert on leadership because he led a rugby team, let us say, to the World Cup. Now, I'm going to ask you a very, very mischievous question. The Economist magazine last week, I think it was, had a very cynical and critical article precisely about the FIFA World Cup and about the management guru stuff that will come out of it. And basically their argument was, yes, there's a kind of industry of management gurus that will qualify themselves because they managed a team in some sport that won the something, and they will then argue they know something about leadership. But the Economist says this has got nothing to do with leadership. Often sports victories are about sheer chance, and it's got leadership of countries, leadership of families, leadership of businesses. There's no crossover at all with being able to lead a rugby team to a World Cup victory. So what are your thoughts about that idea?
Oh, they're many and varied, but I'll start with a light-hearted one, if I may. You and I have a friend in common, Adrian Furneman. Adrian last introduced me on a platform with him to say that David and I are often called gurus, but only by people who can't spell charlatan. And I've often been amused by that idea. Seems to me we can take ourselves far too seriously, and Adrian usually is a good way of debagging us. But what I would say about it is that part of your subject and mine, I'm a psychologist, you're a psychiatrist, one of the things that we try to do in our subject is to figure out what leads to what. In other words, there's a whole bunch of things we do, and we see an awful lot of outcomes happen as a consequence. But connecting specific behaviors to certain specific outcomes is much more difficult. And I think that's the problem that the sports gurus often run into. They know what they did to try and help their team win. They saw the result of what happened. But can they tell you for sure why it happened? Almost certainly not. And that's why I think I wanted to emphasize right from the start, this confluence of three streams. What I've tried to do is act as a leader and notice what happens. as a consultant, work in a variety of different organizations and see the kind of actions that we took together with our clients and see what happens, but then go back to the research literature to see if we can figure out why. And it's usually that bit which is thinnest. So, for example, I'm a great fan of the England rugby team, and I've looked at Eddie Jones's book on leadership. And as a professor in leadership, I can tell you some of the things he writes about, there's a good evidence base for. Some of them, there's none. And so it's a very mixed bag. The problem is that dear Eddie, he knows an awful lot about rugby, but he doesn't know an awful lot about the research based on leadership. And so therefore, can he distinguish between the things that are absolutely thick ice you can stand on and walk on, or does he know where he's getting into thinner ice, or when he's actually under the water and doesn't know it? That's the problem. It's explaining why things work, where you've got to do something a bit more systematic.
Now, in terms of everyone's everyday experience of leadership, there's a sense in which we experience bad managers at work, and we'll talk a bit about that, what people can do about bad leadership, because it's everywhere. It's remarkably difficult to find good leadership. But there's also a sense in which we are all leaders. And I want to talk a bit about the fact, not leaders necessarily in the grand sense of running a company, but running a family, being a father in a family. There's a sense in which you have a leadership role. And I'm interested in your views on that. And I'm going to pick a really trivial example, and you're probably going to run screaming from the room at this example. But it's about the fact that we often become leaders for a moment, and then the leadership moves on. So I was meant to be playing tennis this Monday. There's a drop-in at the Regent's Park Tennis Centre. I live near there. And about 20 people turn up. It would have been raining heavily. So I turned up, and of course, only 3 people were left. The others had gone home because it had been raining. It just stopped raining. And these 3 people were having a coffee in the coffee room. And I said, come on, chaps, let's go and play. It stopped raining. Okay. And there's a kind of leadership thing that's now happening, right? Because I'm trying to lead them away from the coffee into playing tennis. And they were all really reluctant. They all said, no, it's too wet. Okay. And I pointed outside and go, look, it stopped raining. And anyway, basically, the thing that clinched it was that the coach came along who'd meant to be coaching us and said it was too wet. And she showed us on a weather app that there was a gap in the weather. And she said, you've got a gap in the weather right now. It's going to start raining torrentially very soon. So if you're going to play right now. And funnily enough, that seemed to galvanize the 3 to get out of the coffee, and we went and played. So there was something quite interesting. I was reflecting on this, that I arrived just to play tennis, but to try and get a group of people to do what I wanted them to do, I actually was a kind of leader at that moment for a microsecond. And there's a sense in which the tools of leadership would help all of us, because we often find ourselves as a leader for a moment in a family situation or in a situation. So what are your thoughts about that? That we actually don't realize that actually leadership is important personally, even if you're not going to run a company or run a country. What are your thoughts?
I thought you were going to ask me about playing tennis in the rain, but let's assume we're going to talk about leadership. My feeling is that I think that we've had an awful lot of emphasis down through the years on leaders. And I want interested in leadership, exactly as you imply, in fact, as you suggest, that at various times, anyone can take a leadership action. If you think about what leadership is, it's about creating the conditions for people to succeed. That's what I define it as. It's about creating the right conditions. At any given time, I'm not talking about the weather conditions, although that might be one of them. But what I do want to say is that if you are trying to galvanize people into action, you're taking a leadership action from wherever you are, whether you're in an organization or not, whether you have formal authority or not. It doesn't matter. Can I tell you a very personal and intense story? This is about a woman called Carol Jennings. She was driving through Nottingham, listening to the radio in her car, and she heard the Radio Nottingham doctor say, Alzheimer's disease does not run in families, very authoritatively. Carol had a father with Alzheimer's. Carol's father was one of 13 children. Yes, 13 children. 5 of them had Alzheimer's. She knew that that wasn't right. There was at least a version of Alzheimer's that does run in families. And so Carol took a decision. By the way, she's not a medic. Carol is a primary school teacher with no degree, just a teacher training certificate, and she taught very, very young children. She just took a decision right there and then that the doctor was wrong, that medical science, if that was the current state of play, was wrong. She had personal evidence and that she could invite people to come and do some research in her family. She contacted every neurologist whose details she could lay her hands on and invited them to come to Nottingham and investigate her family. The neurology consultant from St Mary's Paddington decided he would take her up on that offer, came to Nottingham, researched her family, and demonstrated that there was a form of Alzheimer's disease that does run in families. And it's intense because, is Carol proud of that? Carol can't remember that because she was right. There is a form of Alzheimer's that runs in families, and Carol is dying. And I know this is true. Carol is my cousin. She acted as a leader the moment she said, that's wrong, and I can do something because of my unique situation. I can do something to fix it. That's leadership, Raj.
So, yes, I agree with you. It's very, very poignant story about the idea that actually when we're trying to make something happen, we become leaders. And I understand your definition. I'm going to challenge your definition a bit. I'm going to go, I don't know the technical words from your field, but I'm going to go with what I would call a more Churchillian view of leadership. And the Churchill as the paradigm is, here's this man who gives these very moving speeches. We shall fight them on the beaches. We shall fight them on the streets. We shall never, ever surrender. And the theory is that Churchill gets a group of people, a team UK, Team Great Britain, to unite and fight this enemy. And it's an existential threat. But what leadership in the Churchillian sense involves is getting each individual to sacrifice their personal self-interest for the interest of the team. And some leaders can do that. So I am interested that you're not picking that definition. You said to help people be successful, but who are the people? Is that because often for the team to be successful, and that means all 11 people lift the World Cup together, but that means a defender may have to pass the ball to the striker when the defender could have tried to score and get personal glory. So I would argue, challenging you a little bit, that true leadership is about helping the team succeed. And obviously when the team succeeds, each individual gets a benefit. But for the team to succeed, what a leader does is get each individual to make personal sacrifices where they put their self-interest secondary to the interest of the team. So anyway, come back at me on that point.
Yeah, of course, Churchill also took the view that you shouldn't wear a hat when presenting a radio program, but let's put that aside. But I think that the other thing about what Churchill did is exactly what my definition suggests. What he's suggesting is he's saying, look, think about the task ahead. Mm-hmm. Think about how we, and that notion of we were in this together was a really big Churchillian theme. Think about how we are going to succeed. And it's not going to be by looking after self. It's going to be about looking after each other. And if that means therefore looking after the nation, then so be it. I'll tell you another thing. I've done literally hundreds personally of leadership assessments of executives from all over the world in all sorts of branches of human endeavor. And one of them, who is currently an HR director at a big FTSE 100 company, told me that before he took the job, he was a soldier. Well, in the semi-autobiographical part of the leadership assessment, I discovered that actually what he was commanding officer of the SAS. And so talking to him about leadership, I was really paying massive attention to what he was telling me. And what he suggested to me is that, people don't die for Queen and country. They die for their colleagues, for their mates, for the people around them. And so what they spent an awful lot of time doing in special forces and also in the army more broadly is that when the emergency light is off, in other words, when there isn't a war that you're fighting right now, they spend almost the entire time doing two things. One is developing the leadership capabilities of those people who have responsibility as officers. But the more important thing is building the sense of team. So it's the sense of we, not I. And that's entirely Churchillian and is one of those preconditions for success.
So now we're going to engage in why people are cynical about leadership, because I'm going to stay with the Churchill example. So Churchill is busy telling the British people, we can do this, we can beat the Germans. But then he goes off to America and says to the Americans, listen, we've got no chance. You've got to come into the war. Otherwise, it's curtains for us. So he's being, at best, duplicitous. I know I'm no overly simplifying the story to make my point, but he's also being what all leaders, I'm going to contend, have to be, is being manipulative. Right now, isn't that why people are cynical about leaders and leadership? Because manipulativeness is at the core, to some extent, of one of the leadership tools. Come back at me on that point.
Yeah, no, interesting. I think it's worth pursuing this one because there are a number of these kind of push it too far and it derails. So before I get to your question, what's the difference between stubbornness and persistence? Persistence is thought to be a good thing, stubbornness a bad thing. And it seems to me that stubbornness is when you've abandoned all kind of logic. There is no rationale anymore. You just can't stop doing the thing you're doing. But persistence is good, and it helps you get through. In fact, my commanding officer of the SAS told me that the thing he'd learned most in the army is how much you can achieve if you simply don't quit. Persistence. But so the example that you've cited is one where I think the distinction that we need to work with is between persuasion and manipulation. And it feels to me not disingenuous at all for Churchill to be saying to the nation, we will not surrender, and to say to America, if we want any chance of winning, you've got to join us. But we won't surrender is completely consistent with we can win, but not on our own. And in many ways, to sort of really make a leap into my beliefs about leadership, that's the thing I want to tell people in any kind of leadership role. You won't do it on your own. In other words, even leadership on its own is hard to do solo. And that's because it's a very broad church. You've got to think a little bit about the strategic implications of your leadership and the strategic predicament that your organization finds itself in, and how you're going to try and tell a story that will persuade people of a way out of that predicament or towards the opportunities that the future affords. There's an operational domain, which is full of facts and details and complexity and so on. And there's an interpersonal domain, which is about getting the right people on the bus with you and in the right places, doing the right things and building relationships that last, and therefore they will cover for each other and so on. All of that is very hard for one person to do well. And that's, neuroplasticity notwithstanding. In other words, the notion that the brain can change. It can, but it changes slowly. And if you want, therefore, to have complete leadership, what you may need to have is the ability to put the right people around you. And one of the tasks that leaders have to do is to create alignment. Now, the cynic would say, oh, they do it by manipulation. But actually, an idealist would say you do it by persuasion, involvement, engagement, and so on. There's a whole variety of non-distorted versions of persuasion that leaders do have to deploy.
Well, I like your nuanced comeback to me that there's a difference between manipulation and persuasion. I think that you're right, but I think a great leader who has a philosophy will choose their words carefully so they're not being duplicitous or lying. But you're a leadership expert and you are paid vast sums of money to assess people's leadership qualities. So I'm going to ask you another mischievous question. We've had a cascade of leaders recently: Johnson, Truss, Sunak. When you hear them give their opening speech in front of Downing Street, and you see them at question time and you hear them being interviewed on the TV, are you forming a judgment about whether they're good leaders or not? And what are you looking for? What are the clues that you're looking for that predict for you how the next few years are going to pan out in terms of their leadership?
I think it's easy to overgeneralize from that set piece. Normally, what I'm interested in listening to there is there any acknowledgement of the true predicament that the country knows itself to be in? Or is it gloss? Is it surface skimming? Secondly, how often do we hear I and how often do we hear we? In other words, leaders have to understand that they've got to get their own egos under control in order to put the right people around them, because they've got to admit what they bring and what they need from others. And the third thing is, I want to know, do I agree with the intentions that they're setting out? Now, none of that will tell me unequivocally, are they likely to succeed? My sense with Liz Truss, and it's easy to be wise after the fact here, but my sense at the time with Liz Truss was, I wonder if you're not sort of taking account sufficiently of the complexity of the situation that we find ourselves in. I'm wondering if therefore time isn't going to prove to be your enemy. And it turned out that was the case, but only I know that I was thinking that at the time. But none of that, I think, is going to be very predictive at all. However, I do believe that there is a different time scale over which you can start to make judgments. And it's the one that the Americans talk about a lot, which is the first 100 days. Wouldn't Liz have loved to have got to 100 days rather than not even quite making 50? But the first 100 days, I think, does begin to tell you what's the sense of urgency, who are they putting around them, what's the sense of team, how aligned do they look, where are they starting the journey, how complete is the map that they've set out for the journey to follow, and so on. I think that the speech outside Downing Street is probably little more than window dressing, but the first 100 days might be quite predictive and helpful.
And of course, the problem with the speech outside Downing Street is maybe not even written by the Prime Minister. It's written by someone else, and the Prime Minister just goes through it and approves it. But I want to stay with one of the key things that we've got, which is facility with language and the way people speak, because that's kind of what we've got most of the time when we see them in action in parliamentary questions or being interviewed on the TV or giving a lecture. And we don't know what's going on behind the scenes. We'd love to know, but we don't. Now, you will know already that psychologists believe that there's a lot that we can tell from the way people speak. There's a very famous example, which is IQ. Intelligence is often correlated with vocabulary, and particularly people who use very rare words from time to time are thought to have a higher IQ. It's a correlation, which is why, by the way, often instead of using the word blue, I will throw in turquoise or azure. And I did run an experiment on Tomorrow's World on TV, which showed that the general public did make an assessment of someone's IQ based on rare words and vocabulary use. So even a very short conversation, you can do massives in impression management by, if you knew this technique and threw in the occasional rare word. If we go to Churchill, we shall fight them on the streets. We shall fight them on the beaches, fight them on the streets. We shall never, ever surrender. I have nothing to offer you but blood, sweat, toil, and tears. People forget the toil bit. The man had a facility with language, whatever you may think about his politics. He was a poet almost, right? And there's a sense in which we may be wrong to form a judgment about his leadership qualities, but definitely he must have been, and there's no doubt about this, a very intelligent man, and his language revealed that. And I'm going to take another example. Martin Luther King, famous Washington March, I have a dream speech, okay? Mrs. Thatcher, we should run the economy a bit like a housewife. A housewife runs the economy this way. Now, that was a very bad analogy because an economy is not the same thing as a housewife's budget. But there is something about the use of metaphor, analogy, painting a picture with words, which we don't seem to see with the current bunch of leaders we've got. But I think there's something there, I'm interested in your opinion, that tells us something about leadership, not least because at least it's persuasive, or it's someone who is emotive and can actually manipulate the emotions of the listener, which is one of the things that leadership is required of leaders. But anyway, what are your thoughts about what I'm driving at? The facility with language, the ability to paint a picture, metaphor, analogy, the I have a dream speech. Does that tell us something about leadership?
Yes, it does. But I'm going to just hark back, if I may, just a moment to the set speech outside Downing Street. You can't tell much from that for the very reason that I want to just re-emphasize that you made. Someone else has probably written it. And the other thing is that people have had an awful lot of time to look up the right words, to make sure that they're using the right words and so on. But if you have a conversation with someone which is much more casual, the sort of judgments that people will make of you and me, terrifyingly, Raj, because we're not scripted now, our use of language, our choice of words is going to be much more revealing. Because in a sense, we're not so well defended or prepared for the choice of each syllable, let alone each word. Now, so having put that aside, what I want to say is that, yes, leadership has a role in inspiring. when I write about leadership, I talk about 7 tasks that leaders need to get done that sit within those 3 domains that I mentioned to you, the strategic, the operational, the interpersonal. But I'm very conscious also that there are a number of enablers, and I've identified 5, the first of which is the ability to be able to inspire people. Now, think about what inspiration is. Inspiration has to stand firmly on 2 feet, not 1. Inspiration has an intellectual component. It's very hard to inspire people with poor data, sloppy logic, a weak argument, discontinuous thoughts, and so on. Disconnected incoherence is unlikely to inspire. That's intellectual. But the head in inspiration simply orientates us. It says, we've got to go this way, not this way. No, not quite that way, more there. It can make so nuanced, subtle judgments about the direction that we need to head in and can make a case as to why. But inspiration stands on another foot, which is the foot of emotion, which kind of propels us down that road. So the head tells us the direction, the heart pushes us down that road, or if you like, pulls us down that road. And the distinction between push and pull is quite an important one, which I could elaborate on if you want. But it will. You need to be able to touch both. And it seems to me that in organizational life, we are embarrassed time and again by our feelings. The health service is on its knees right now. My daughter is a GP, and she is on her knees because of the anger that people bring to the consulting room, because they see an empty waiting room, believing that therefore the GPs are not working enough. The truth is that they're still trying to practice infection control, and so they're really trying to make sure that crowds don't gather in those waiting rooms as they used to. And they're working 12-hour days. They're absolutely on the chin strap. They're about stretched as far as they can possibly be. And if I were leading any part of the health service right now, I would want to appeal to the hearts as well as the minds of everyone concerned to just be massively appreciative, recognizing of, thankful for the heart that people put into this. They care for people. And the word healthcare, we emphasize health. Please can we emphasize care as well? We've got to understand that head and heart get connected for good leaders to be able to inspire. And we've got to enable our leaders to be in touch with their hearts, not just with their hearts. We're not trying to, run an evangelical show here. What we're trying to do is inspire people, head and heart.
You said something about emotions. We're embarrassed about emotions at work. Could you say something more about that? It's a very interesting phrase.
Yeah, it's in the sense that if you look at what happens in organizational life most often is the emotions that we're happy to express are, well, I said the word happy. People are okay about positive emotions. They're okay with happiness. They can't help themselves from time to time with anger or frustration. But what about worry? What about care, concern? If I'm trying to work with you, Raj, and I notice that you seem to be under par, how comfortable am I, particularly if you're my boss, how comfortable am I going to you and saying, how are you doing? Can we just have 5 minutes? Are you okay? And that care does distinguish, interestingly, in the research between the most adaptive and most successful teams and those that are not so effective or adaptive, because that care looks after people, sets up a safe environment. The safe environment encourages people to take risks and try new things and innovate. Innovation always carries a risk of failure, and many times it will fail. But if people feel that others have their back, that they're concerned for them, that they care for them, that they've got some feeling for them, they will be trusted and they will give it a go. And it turns out that in a study that was done in Israel of 77 management teams, it turns out that the most adaptive ones were characterized by interest in and concern for each team member's welfare. Now, that's a lesson. The lesson, if you want me to really generalize it, is where's the role of love in the organization? Who can we love and care for in that sense. Because if you think about it, we're going to give the best years of our life and the best hours of each day to our employer. And it turns out, again, from decent research, that if you know that people care for you in the workplace, it's protective of your health and increases your effectiveness as an employee as well.
Well, let's talk about that. So you will talk in a rather direct way, and you must come back and challenge me about your daughter's a GP in the health service. So there's a problem. Leadership can flower when people have the freedom and autonomy to act independently and make leadership decisions. In an overly regulated, very heavily regulated area like the health service, it is very difficult to be a leader. So there's a problem with over-regulation, which inhibits freedom. The other problem, and I'm going to bang this drum a little bit, which is that your daughter may care brilliantly for her patients, but if she doesn't fill out all the paperwork and tick all the boxes on the computer screen, then someone somewhere will come down on her like a ton of bricks. And she'll get clobbered because the paperwork wasn't filled out correctly. I was sitting at my GPs in the National Health Service many years ago, and she's a brilliant GP. And she said to me, she's very worried about the Care Quality Commission inspection that was about to happen the next day. And I said, why are you so worried? And she said, well, we're going to fail because, we haven't got this, we haven't got that. And all of it was administrative rubbish to do with, was there a disability ramp up this room or that room or whatever? It had nothing to do with care. And one of the problems is that identifying the essence of what is a great teacher at university, for example, all these things are difficult to measure. And in an overly regulated, overly bureaucratic system, only what is measurable, only the tick box exercise has any purchase, has any currency. And that strangles the ability for all these intangibles you're referring to, which are actually the most important thing, the love, the care, what's an education is an intangible thing. Those things are getting strangled. And that's why systems aren't working. What are your thoughts about that?
If you want to do one of these programs about the purpose of the health service, I'm about to start a project on that. I think we need a national debate about that. Let's put that aside for a minute, but let me pick up the leadership issues. In order to bring out the best in people, if I could give people a few sort of really simple, straightforward pointers, the first thing I'd say is make clear the purpose that we're all trying to serve. Let's get really clear about that. So at the university, I spend an awful lot of time at the business school here working on executive education. I believe that what's distinctive about coming for executive education to a business school is that the business school will be aware of that third stream of activity, i.e. the research activity, what's happened and been published and been tested, and we know we can stand on it because we understand the dynamics around the ideas. What you'll get from most consulting firms is limited research, and what you'll get is some bright sparks, great ideas. And maybe someone who has been there and done it, got a few T-shirts and want to tell you how they did it. Yeah, that's the sort of Jack Welch approach, as it were. I am very clear that in our executive education programs, one of the purposes that we need to serve is to help people understand what's gone before and been tried and tested and how, and what's failed the tests and what's passed them, so that we can give them something firm. I'm clear about that purpose. The second thing I want them to be clear about is the values that guide our actions. Purpose and values. Now, in a world which is rapidly changing, and ours is, in a world which is changing largely unpredictably, and ours is, there are many times that you may be stuck with kind of improvising action that you've not really fully thought through. But the clearer you are about your purpose on the one hand and your values on the other, and I mean, I don't mean the things that we hang on a plaque on the wall that say these are our values. I mean the real values that really do guide us. The clearer you can be about those two things, and the clearer you can be about that to everyone who works with you in your team, in your organization, whatever, the more autonomy you can give them. But if they step outside of those two things, if they want to pursue different purposes or with different values, that's when we have a boundary problem and maybe even an inclusion problem. And by that, I'm using a euphemism, they might need to go. But I agree with you the more autonomy we can give people, the more they like it and the more we bring out the best in them. In fact, there's some good neuroscience research that says exactly that. A woman called Hilary Scarlett has put together the acronym SPACES that talks about if you want to get people in the right possible frame of mind, you need to think about their self-esteem, their purpose, their autonomy, the level of certainty they work with, the equity in the organization, and the social connections. SPACES is the acronym. And autonomy turns out to be one of those vital few ingredients that bring out the best in most people most of the time. But the precondition for getting autonomy is agreement, buy-in, alignment about purpose and values.
Okay, so in the health service, for example, I'm hearing always about the waiting time to be seen by a doctor in casualty and the waiting list before you get your hip operation. As a doctor, I'm very cynical about that because the issue to me is you may wait 4 hours to see someone in casualty, but what's the quality of the care you're getting at the end of the 4 hours? Okay. If you're getting brilliant care after 4 hours, that may not be so bad as opposed to waiting 2 hours and getting crap care. Why they're parroting the 2 hour, 4 hour thing? Because it's measurable and it seems to people it's giving an indication of what's really going on. It's not at all. If after 4 or 5 hours or whatever, the care is crap, that's the key thing. I mean, the only way leaders can get a sense of that is to walk the shop floor. If they're just relying on the statistics coming in, where they don't go to the casualty department and see the chaos on the ground. And in my experience, I'm going to say something very mischievous and politically incorrect, of leadership in the NHS was we never met the managers or the leaders on the shop floor. They never came to the ward round. They never saw them walking the wards, etc., etc. And that qualitative sense of what it feels like was missing from a lot of these leaders. So for me, so there's that problem, which is genuine interest of a leader is someone who wants to walk the shop floor and get a sense of what's really going on, because the numbers don't tell you quite a lot about what's really going on. And the second point I have to make is that these euphemisms we keep hearing over and over again, the NHS is at a tipping point. The NHS is under pressure. Look, the reality is NHS just doesn't work in some places. It actually has collapsed, okay? But no one's willing to say that. And again, you can't get great leadership when no one's willing to be honest. Now, a famous philosopher, economist, Hayek, said that something, he was a very right-wing economist, admittedly, that when you have a state-run system, because it can't work, because he was a right-wing economist, what they spend a lot of time doing is moving away from trying to make the thing work. And you saw this in East Germany and Communist Russia, into public relations. They spent a lot of time trying to convey the idea the system's working. More and more of the resources of the organization get into the picture they project to the outside world, whereas on the inside, it just gets worse and worse. So again, what are your thoughts about some of those ideas that the numbers don't tell us the story? People are not being honest, often in a state-run system, and they don't walk the shop floor. What are your thoughts?
I mean, I could very, very quickly answer yes. I agree with that. I wouldn't completely dismiss time, may I say. That in some conditions, time is an indicator of quality.
Okay.
I had septicemia. It was progressing up my leg. If they hadn't got the antibiotics into me quickly, I'd have died. Very simple.
Yeah, no, I accept that point.
Yes. So waiting for the doctor to get around to me was a matter of life and death. So it was an indicator of quality. But I take your point entirely, that it's very tempting to measure the things we can measure and manage the things that we measure, and therefore we end up managing only the things that are not just measurable but easily measurable. We know from the world of experimentation that you can devise measures of all sorts of things, but if they're costly in themselves and complex in themselves, people won't use them. So we tend to manage the easily measurable. Secondly, you make the point very well, I think, and I agree with it, that in order to lead people well, you've got to be close to what they're doing. I talked about inspire being one of the enablers. Another one that I would argue is critical is the notion of reinforcing people for doing things that are good, that are the right things. In order to be able to do that, you've got to be close to what they're doing. You can't do that from a distance. And it seems to me that the moment you start to dig into what we know about leadership, the more you then start to challenge what is common but poor practice.
So another thing we see in the health service quite a lot, and in regulatory authorities as well, which again, I'm often in my writings very critical of regulatory bodies, is you see people who are leaders leading a regulatory authority, let's say, and their background is nothing to do with the thing they're regulating, right? Let's take healthcare. They never ran a hospital or never were in a hospital or have no degrees in medicine or in healthcare, yet they seem to be appointed as leaders. And often the career pathway is through the civil service in some sense. And there's some political reason in the background that explains why certain people seem to end up running the health service, despite the fact they have no background in the thing in itself. What are your thoughts about that? Do you think it's really important that people really have a background in the thing? Like your SAS guy, I suspect didn't come from Deutsche Bank. He came up through the army, right?
Absolutely.
So what's your sense of the notion that what you're looking for is some track record in the thing in itself? Because increasingly we see that in a lot of areas in public life, that someone is running something and they got nothing to do with the thing itself. In their background.
Look, it's a very tempting, in a sense, simple argument, isn't it? In order to lead X, you've got to know something about X, whatever it may be. And yet, Dame Sharon White is leading, is it the John Lewis Partnership, and she has no background in retail at all. But maybe she's good as a strategic thinker. Maybe she's good at bringing out the best in people around her and so on. I think there is a confounding factor here, Raj, and it's simply this. If you've got a kind of dominant leadership style, you'd better know an awful lot about what you're talking about, because you're going to place yourself as having a monopoly on wisdom. And it's a very dangerous position, however much you know about a particular topic. It's a very dangerous position to be in. Why? Because the world is moving fast and it's moving unpredictably, and the size and the challenge of issues is increasing. So as a consequence, however much you know about X, if you're going to lead an organization that does X, you're still going to have to listen to other people with different points of view. The second thing I would say is that if you do have the ability to invite alternative points of view and you can lead a decision-making process, then it may be that you don't have to bring the detailed background in the subject that you're trying to get decisions made about. So, for example, when BT floated BT Cellnet as a mobile phone company, they asked a guy called Peter Erskine to lead it. And the predictions at the time, you may remember, were that it was a terrible mobile phone company. It was going to fail. Within 4 years, the leadership team there, led by Peter Erskine, had transformed it into O2. It was the young person's sexy, hip mobile phone company. They had an exclusive first 6 months access to the Apple iPhone when it first came out. And within 4 years, they sold it to Telefonica of Spain for 27 billion euros. It was the most extraordinary, successful, I was going to say turnaround story, but it was almost a kind of rescue story and then a turnaround story. And Peter Erskine, I got a chance to talk to a lot about this because I was doing a bit of work with him at the time. And he came to Oxford to make a presentation just after the 27 billion sale to Telefonica. And one of the things he said that completely shocked everyone was, "I'm not a strategist." And everyone was kind of heckling him. "Come off it, don't be ridiculous. Of course you of course you are." He said, "No, I'm really not." He said, I'm an operations guy. He said, "My mantra is deliver, deliver, deliver." But realizing that, the first person I hired was a really good strategist in the telecoms field. And I put him in the next door office to me. And by the way, I happen to know, Raj, that his finance director was really good in the interpersonal domain. So I talked about the strategic, the operational, the interpersonal domains as the three bases you've got to get covered in leadership terms. Peter was the operations guy. He appointed a strategic thinker. He also had in his finance lead someone who was brilliant interpersonally, who incidentally followed Peter Erskine as CEO after Peter stood down. The point is, Peter didn't bring strategic thinking and clarity. He brought the implementation of great strategic thinking and the enablement of a great strategic thinker. So can you see where I'm going with this? What I'm trying to say is, if you're the world's authority on X and you're going to lead an organization that does X, I think you're at great risk of trying to be a solo practitioner, of trying to be the hero leader with a monopoly on wisdom. That's really inadvisable.
Okay, well, let's talk about a man that's in the news a lot at the moment. I know we're not really allowed to directly comment, but Elon Musk is very much in the news at the moment and seems, I mean, after all, the guy's got this amazing track record of creating companies from nothing that, are become the biggest companies in the world. And Tesla, for example, has transformed the car making industry. And now he's taken over Twitter. And the sense we get from the outside, how much do we know about what's really going on, is that he is a bit like this kind of leader who is not surrounding himself by a group of people from which he takes lessons, that he's giving out the lessons. And there's a sense in which he has enormous authority given his track record, but I suspect from what you've just told me, you would think there's a grave danger of this kind of leadership falling over because of this sense of messianic belief in their ability. But what are your thoughts?
I think that there are, at any given time in the world, a small subset of people with extraordinary ability. Steve Jobs is one, I think. I think Elon Musk is another. But what's their extraordinary ability in? I think it's an imaginative capability. It's imagining how different things could be if only we could do A, B, and C. If they've then got the ability to make A, B, and C happen, then they can translate that imaginative understanding and insight into action that has remarkable consequences. I don't think it's a very common attribute, because I think people talk about, what's your superpower? Well, I haven't got any. I don't know about you, Raj. I haven't got any. But I'm reasonably able in a couple of things. But I think that a few people might have a kind of, almost on the edge of a kind of an extraordinary gift. And I don't want to knock it, but what I don't want to do is overgeneralize from it. So, for example, Jobs had an ability to inspire technologists, but his leadership and management style, by all accounts, was brutal, not enabling in any way. It was domineering rather than leadership. But the world forgave him because he gave us, the Mac, the iPad, the iPhone. Interestingly, Apple has been more profitable since Jobs left and actually shuffled off this mortal coil. It's had greater growth since Jobs than with Jobs. So there's some other ingredient which is about getting the best out of people, teams, and organizations, which I think Jobs didn't have, but he had this amazing ability to conceive of what the world needed without having to resort to focus groups or numerate research.
So we're running out of time a little bit, but I want to challenge you a little bit on one aspect, which is I, as a doctor, am talking to you because I'm very interested in the fact that doctors are increasingly being called upon to be leaders in the National Health Service in particular. And there is some research evidence, I think, from private hospitals or hospitals across the world that finds that if the hospital is being run by a doctor, it tends to be slightly better run than if it's run by someone who isn't a doctor. But the trouble is, doctors have an arduous training, and doctors who love the practice of medicine don't want to go into management. And then they complain when they're being managed by non-doctors, because medicine's a very complex thing. And most doctors, arrogantly perhaps, will complain that the manager who's not got a medical degree doesn't understand the thing that they're attempting to manage. So we've got this tension. My experience, and I'm going to say something very rude and mischievous now, is that the doctors who are attracted to management, I'm going to say something very going to land me in trouble, aren't necessarily very good doctors. Because if you're a very good doctor and you love what you do and you're a brilliant surgeon and the patients love you, Why would you go into management? It's the people who go into management are often the people not finding the practice of medicine very rewarding. So what about that tension? Because you said earlier, and I take on board what you say, that you don't have to have a background in a thing to manage it well. But when something is very complicated, like medicine, for example, and doctors often sit around and bitch to each other about, who's actually good in medicine and who isn't. And it's a very, very difficult thing to identify. And I trust when I'm talking to other doctors that we do know who's really a good doctor and who isn't. And the patient has to rely on us for recommendations. But what about this problem, which is if you're really good at the thing, this is an academic life as well, you don't want to go on to be the vice chancellor of the university, right? Because you're good at the thing. You want to publish research. So you end up being managed by people who know nothing about the nuance or the difficulty of teaching students or doing academic work. There's this constant tension in any complex task between the people who are really good at it, don't want to do management, and the people who want to do management of it aren't very good at it. Do you agree with that tension? Or what do you think?
It's very interesting. I was at a dinner at one of the medical Royal Colleges last week, and a former president of that particular Royal College came up to me and said, anyone who wants to go on a leadership program should be excluded from any leadership opportunities.
Right.
So, and I get your point. It's the popular version of those that can do, those that can't teach, isn't it? Or if you're Raj Persaud, then you say those that can do and those that can't manage. Then and they prove that they can't manage. But the point is that you need to have real respect for the capabilities of the people that you're responsible for leading. And you need to have an understanding that leadership is not about giving people instructions. It is about helping them set direction. It's about making sure that we have alignment between us. It's about building relationships. It's about making sure that there are decent plans in place to stop people spinning their wheels or wasting resources and so on. It's about facilitating teams and then ultimately understanding that day to day, moment to moment, you've got to deliver results. Now, what have I done there? I've just talked to you around the 7 leadership tasks that I think that we've got to enable people to do. The second thing I'd say is that, so we need to understand what leadership is and what it requires. And I think a lot of people don't have that understanding. I think the second thing I'd say is that my SAS commanding officer was in the army for 17 years. He had never had an evaluation that was less than the best evaluation in the army at the time. So when he came out of Sandhurst, he won the Sword of Honor. He was the best. He was the best of the best of the best. But he understood, and he absolutely endorsed the ideas, incidentally, that I'm sharing with you, Raj, because he said that, whenever the red light's off, we're building the team. That's what we're doing. We're trying to get people to kind of really buy into us and we and what we're trying to achieve and how we will enable each other and look after each other and so on. But the other thing that he told me that shocked me rigid, you think about how much development as a leader has the average leader in healthcare or industry or corporate life or, in the public sector. How much training as a leader have they had? Well, let me tell you that I'm going to slightly hedge my bets here because I can't remember between 2 numbers, but he was in the army for 17 years. I asked him how much time did they vote to developing him as a leader? He said, I think it was 3 or it might have been 5 years of the 17 off the job, being developed as a leader.
Wow.
Yeah. No, but let's take the smaller number. Let's say it was 3 years, but 3 years off the job in 17, being developed as a leader. Now, what do most people get? A weekend, access to a copy of a leadership book. I still remember talking to one manufacturing organization about what could we do to develop their leaders. And they told me a number of years ago that their budget was a bit tight. And I said, what is your budget? Give me a sense of it. And he said, £50. And I said, well, okay, how many people in your organization? How many times 50 per person does that mean? He said, no, £50. And I said, how many people in the organization? He said 10,000. I said, which book are you going to buy? We play at it, Raj. We criticize leaders and leadership. We don't invest in them. Anything
Okay.
like
Okay. But you said something very significant that's ringing a lot of bells for me. The notion
I
of
knew
respect.
if I talked enough, I'd say something significant.
You've got a great sense of humor, which seems to be lacking in a lot of leaders. I mean, Churchill had a great sense of humor. The last three we've had have not had a great sense of humor, in my opinion. Although the first one, Johnson was meant to have a sense of humor. I wouldn't call that a sense of humor. Anyway, you said something about if you're running a hospital, but you're not a doctor, you at least need to respect doctors. Okay. Now, the experience of doctors is that they're led by people who don't respect doctors, and if anything, seem to spend their time attacking doctors. And many people say the same thing of the regulatory authorities, that we find ourselves inspected and being grilled and questioned by people who do not appear to respect or don't signal any respect. They seem to assume you're a serial killer unless proven otherwise, or you're incompetent, or you're busy cutting corners and killing your patients unless proven otherwise. So there is a problem, isn't there? You will know that many academics feel the same way about the way they're treated by university administration with the teaching workload and so on. Is there a tension between the notion of an organization on the outside appearing efficient and the pursuit of efficiency and the pursuit of respect by let's say the people who run a hospital of their doctors? Because doctors complain that the leaders of hospitals who aren't doctors don't respect doctors at all. I suspect your daughter, who's a GP, would have complained about a lack of respect from, although she's an independent practitioner who are independently contracted to the health service. GPs are different to consultants in that sense. There's a sense in which she has to deal with leaders in the health service at some point. Anyway, what are your thoughts about that point? That this respect thing is a big issue for some reason.
The study published in the Harvard Business Review of 2007 by a woman called Porath, who talked about the effect of respect. And I'm not going to be able to remember the numbers, but it has the most extraordinarily strong impact on all sorts of aspects of people's orientation to work, their productivity, their sense of well-being, their commitment to the organization, even their health. And yet, 50% of the people in her study complained that they didn't get respect. And how much does it cost to show respect? Literally zip, nothing, nada, not a single penny. So there's a little puzzle there. So as a psychologist, or maybe you as a psychiatrist ought to analyze this. I believe that what's going on is that leaders who are under pressure cope with it for a while, but we know that if that goes on for too long, they experience collapse. And what that does is it collapses them in on themselves. That I'm now no longer concerned about you. I'm concerned about me. I'm concerned about the pressures on me, not on you. I'm concerned about the work I do. And did I do a good, decent job today? Not you, and whether you did a decent job today. And that sense of being collapsed in on by the world around you is, I think, at the heart of an awful lot of this. So if we ask people to be psychiatrists or counselors or coaches, we give them supervision. But by supervision, what we mean actually is support. It's that kind of supervision. Whereas I think most people in leadership roles don't get anything like enough of that. There was a study published by Gallup that literally 100% of the sample said that they had worked for an intolerable leader. And I think it was 70% of the sample said that they would take a pay cut if they could work for a different boss. And so there's something non-sustainable about that. We need to get to the bottom of it. But what we've got to do is to create workplaces in which people are supported as well as challenged. We've got to understand that challenge and support are not at opposite ends of a continuum. They are orthogonal to each other. You can maximize both. And if the world itself is intrinsically challenging, then the role of the leader is to provide the support that allows people to sustain their energy and effort in that challenging environment.
Well, Professor David Pendleton, we're rapidly running out of time. You've written some books with Professor Adrian Furnham, who taught me as a student. Tell us a bit about your most recent book, and tell us a bit about some of the books you've written with Adrian. You get a chance to plug your books now in the last minute.
Oh, well, that's wonderful. Well, the book is called Leadership. It's got 3 editions, and the latest edition is called Leadership, No More Heroes. And I've been trying to talk about this notion of leadership in the plural. It's not so much how to lead teams as how to get teams to lead. And that's rather important. The other one that I did in lockdown and published in 21 was a book called Work-Life Matters, which was not with Adrian, but with a couple of other authors. But I'm the first author in both cases, so if you look them up, if you follow my name, you'll find them. But Work-Life Matters is all about, not about work-life balance, because I find that a sort of nonsense concept. Work is an important part of life, and people who lose their work, they sort of lose their marbles as well, and their health and so on. So what I'm trying to do is to get that shifted around through 90 degrees to say, how do we create balance in our work life? In other words, in our life at work. And both of them, therefore, are ultimately about leadership. But the one is called Leadership, No More Heroes, and the other is called Work-Life Matters.
Well, thank you very much, Professor David Pendleton. Thank you very much indeed for talking to us today. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Bye.
Bye.